I was ready for work, sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee and the local paper. Laura was still upstairs getting dressed. This morning felt just like any other day for the past year. I skimmed the front page, and there it was, right in the center, exactly as Victor had mentioned last night. Victor always keeps his word. The article reported the death of a man in his garage. Mike Dawson, an employee at Ridgeway Realty, was found murdered. He'd been beaten and strangled. Laura works at Ridgeway Realty too. The police had no suspects yet, and the investigation had just begun. I didn't need to read further. I folded the paper and set it down in Laura's usual spot. A strange calm settled over me as I sipped my coffee, thinking about how the events of this morning fit together. As Laura came into the room, I glanced up at her. She looked as beautiful as the day I first met her, 5 years ago. My wife of 5 years hadn't lost any of her charm. She didn't say anything as she poured herself some coffee, continuing the silence we had grown accustomed to. It's amazing how much our marriage had changed in just a year. Our eyes met briefly, and I forced a small smile, acknowledging her presence. She didn't respond, keeping up the cold distance that had developed over the past 2 months, ever since we had that argument about her late nights at work. Since then, she had pulled away from me, a sharp contrast to the warmth we once shared. She picked up the paper in one hand and her coffee in the other, her eyes quickly scanning the headlines. All of a sudden, she gasped and spat out her coffee. Her eyes locked on the article about Mike Dawson's murder. "Oh my God, no!" she cried, her face turning pale as she rushed to the bathroom. I sat there quietly, knowing I didn't need to say anything. I stood up, placed my coffee cup in the sink, grabbed my briefcase, and headed for the garage. I didn't check on her. I didn't care about her feelings anymore. Let me introduce myself. My name is Jake Camillo, but most people call me Jake. I'm 30 years old and grew up in the Italian district of Chicago. As a kid, I spent most of my time with a gang of other Italian boys who liked to think of themselves as a junior mafia. I'll skip the details of all the trouble we got into, but there was one moment that changed the course of my life. My best friend, Victor Marino, and I were closer than brothers. We did everything together. The big difference between us? Victor always found trouble with the law, while I somehow managed to avoid getting caught. One night, we broke into a warehouse down by the river, hoping to score some stuff we could sell for cash. The security guards must have seen us sneaking in because when we tried to leave with a few boxes, they were waiting for us. One guard grabbed Victor, and another came after me. I threw a box in the guard's face and tackled the other one, knocking him down. I shouted for Victor to run, and he did, leaving me behind. The second guard managed to grab me, and the struggle was over. The guards roughed me up before the cops showed up. When they arrived, they laughed as they hauled me off to the station. I spent the night in a cell until my parents came to bail me out. In the end, I never ratted out Victor. I got 2 weeks in juvenile detention and probation. Victor called me later, apologizing for leaving me, but I told him it was fine. With his record, he could have gone away for years. He promised to pay me back someday. After that, my parents were furious. My dad gave me a beating I'll never forget, and then decided to send me to St. Joseph's Catholic School to straighten me out. The nuns and priests there didn't mess around. By the time I graduated, I was a different person. One of the priests took me under his wing and convinced me to leave the old neighborhood behind. I got accepted into the University of Illinois and worked hard to turn my life around. I graduated with a degree in human resources and found a good job soon after. For a while, I dated casually, but nothing serious came of it. It wasn't until 3 years after college that I met Laura Ricci at an HR conference. She was different from anyone I'd ever known, confident, intelligent, and with a complexity that drew me in. After the conference, I got her number, and things took off from there. Laura had a stubborn streak that sometimes reminded me of characters from old films, strong-willed and impossible to sway once she made up her mind. But despite her tough exterior, there was something about her that kept me intrigued. Over time, I learned she had been abandoned as a child, left at a hospital, and raised in foster homes. That explained a lot about the walls she had built around herself, but I didn't mind. I was hooked. I truly believe that the lack of a mother's love during Laura's childhood played a huge part in shaping her personality. Despite her struggles, during our early years together, She was the most affectionate and warm-hearted person I had ever known. My parents, however, weren't as supportive of my relationship with Laura. Throughout our time dating, they warned me against getting too serious with her, but I ignored their concerns. Laura and I got married in a simple ceremony at our local church. We decided to hold off on starting a family until we were financially secure and she could focus on being a full-time mom, a decision that didn't sit well with my parents. The trouble in our marriage started around the 3rd year. That's when Laura lost her job after her company was taken over by a larger corporation. Even though we weren't struggling financially, it hit her hard. She had loved that job, and the months that followed were tough for her. It took some time for her to find another job, and when she finally did, she wasn't thrilled about it. She ended up working as an office manager at Ridgeway Realty, which felt like a step down to her. I tried to be supportive, but there were times when I could tell she resented the fact that I was happy with my career while she was just settling. Her mood swings became more noticeable during this period, especially around her monthly cycle. After a few months at Ridgeway, she slowly started to bounce back to her usual cheerful self, and things between us improved. Our bedroom life, which had taken a hit during her unemployment, got better too. There were times when I could feel her trying to make up for the rough patch by being more assertive in bed. I wasn't about to complain. For about 9 months, our marriage seemed to thrive again. Laura grew more excited about her job and even began taking real estate courses online, which I fully supported. I was happy to see her returning to the woman I had fallen in love with. Then, both good and bad news came. The good news was that I was steadily climbing the management ranks at my company. After 5 years, my future looked promising. The bad news came when my company merged with another based out of Dallas. That merger meant big changes for me. I was tasked with integrating their team into our structure, which involved training new staff and making cuts. While I was excited about the challenge, the downside was that it required me to travel more and for longer stretches. Laura wasn't happy about it. Even though I made sure to be home every weekend, she still resented the time I spent away. At first, Laura seemed to accept it, but gradually, it wasn't enough. I could feel her pulling away. She started accusing me of enjoying my time away from home and even hinted that I might be having an affair in Dallas. I did everything I could to reassure her, called her during the day, sent flowers and funny cards, but nothing seemed to thaw her coldness. After 6 months, my time in Dallas came to an end, and I was promoted to a higher position at headquarters. I thought this would ease some of the tension, but I was wrong. Laura threw herself deeper into her work at Ridgeway, picking up more hours and responsibilities. When I asked her about it, she snapped back sarcastically, saying it was her turn to work for a promotion and that I should get used to being alone in the evenings. Our closeness was slipping further away. 2 weeks ago, Laura told me she'd be out of town for the weekend, attending a developers conference for riverfront condos with her colleagues. She didn't even ask me how I felt about it. She made it clear that it was important for her career, leaving me with no room to argue. Even though I had left the old gang behind back in high school, I still kept in touch with some of the guys, especially Victor. I gave him a call and asked if he wanted to catch the Browns versus Steelers game on Sunday. He didn't hesitate. Victor always knew how to score the best tickets for a Steelers game. I mentioned that Laura would be gone, and Victor suggested I spend the weekend with him and the old crew, catching up. The idea of getting away for a couple of days sounded perfect, so I didn't bother telling Laura about my plans. Friday morning was chilly, and over breakfast, I casually asked how I could reach her while she was away. Laura brushed me off, saying she'd be busy with important people and didn't want any interruptions. The way she said it made me feel like I was more of a nuisance than a husband. I let it go. That afternoon, Laura left for Atlantic City without so much as a goodbye. Meeting up with Victor felt like old times. We hadn't hung out in over a year, and I was one of the few guys who managed to get out of the neighborhood without getting into serious trouble. Victor reminded me about that favor he still owed me, saying he was ready to repay it whenever I needed. Saturday night, we hit up the Sweet Fox Lounge on the east side of town, a strip club not unlike the Bada Bing from The Sopranos. The place was packed, full of barely dressed dancers. A young woman who didn't look much older than 18 came over and started dancing provocatively in front of me. Victor made it a point to mention that she was available for the night, heavily implying that she could be mine if I wanted. He even got a bit handsy with her as he said it. Despite the temptation, I stayed firm. I told Victor that I was committed to my marriage, that as tempting as it was, loyalty and fidelity were important to me. I declined the dancer's advances, and she moved on to another guy without a second thought. Victor looked at me like I'd grown a second head, saying he couldn't believe I was that serious about the whole faithfulness thing. I just told him, without trust, there's no love and no marriage. The next morning, typical cold, windy Cleveland weather hit, but it didn't stop the crowds from heading to the stadium for the Browns vs. Steelers game. The rivalry between those two teams was as fierce as ever, with a history that went back decades. Every matchup felt like a war. I could barely hear myself think with all the screaming and cheering, and by the end of it, my throat was sore. The game was intense, and in the end, the Browns edged out the Steelers, 21-20. It was an epic finish to the day, and Victor wanted to keep the celebration going. He suggested we hit up a bar, but I had to turn him down. Work was waiting for me on Monday, and I didn't want to drag myself through it with a hangover. Besides, Laura was supposed to be coming home that night, and I wanted to be there when she got back. But she didn't show up. Sunday night came and went, and there was no sign of her. By Monday morning, I was already leaving for work, feeling uneasy about what was happening in my marriage. The sinking feeling I had wasn't new. For a while now, things had felt off. Sure, all marriages go through rough patches, but this felt like something worse, like our marriage was on life support and no one knew how to revive it. Monday was just as chaotic as I'd expected. I spent most of the day in back-to-back meetings, dealing with high-level issues, including a major discrimination lawsuit that had been filed against the company. It wasn't until 5:30 that I finally got a chance to sit down and check my emails. There were the usual dozen messages from the team, along with updates on the lawsuit. But near the end of the inbox, there was an email that caught my eye. Subject line: who was the last to know? Thinking it was some kind of joke, I clicked on it, expecting a funny video or cartoon. But instead, my screen was filled with a photo of Laura, my wife, wrapped in a passionate kiss with another man. My stomach dropped. Underneath the photo was a message that read, "Want to see what happened next? Click the link." A cold, sick feeling crept up my spine. My hand hovered over the mouse, shaking, as I stared at the image of Laura locked in another man's arms. I hesitated for a second, then clicked the link. The next photo came up. This time, both Laura and the man were naked, standing in a dingy motel room. The text at the bottom said, "Want to know what happened after this? Click the next link." My throat tightened. My heart raced. Part of me wanted to stop there, close the email, and pretend I hadn't seen any of it. But I couldn't. I clicked again. The final photo was the nail in the coffin of my marriage. Laura was on the bed, on all fours, with the same man from the previous photos, a look of raw lust and pleasure on her face. The woman I had trusted with all my heart, the only woman I had ever truly loved, had betrayed me in the worst way possible. My stomach churned. I felt like I was going to be sick. The message below the photo read, "Courtesy of Mark Hudson." In that moment, something inside me snapped. The recent coldness, the distance, it wasn't just a phase in our marriage. Laura had been cheating on me, and now I had undeniable proof. But instead of exploding in anger, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, a resolve I hadn't felt in years. Infidelity and betrayal, these things wouldn't go unpunished. Two people were going to pay for what they'd done to me. My thoughts immediately shifted to the person who had sent me these emails. No name, no clue about their identity. Why had they sent these photos? What was their goal? Were they trying to hurt Laura, or was this some kind of twisted favor? My mind raced with questions, but the only thing that was crystal clear was the raw betrayal staring back at me from my computer screen. I knew I'd have to figure out some of these questions later. I slipped a CD into my computer, copied the email and the 3 photos, then deleted everything. I ran a scrubber program to erase all traces from my hard drive. As I leaned back in my swivel chair, trying to make sense of Laura's betrayal, I could only chalk it up to her complex personality. But if she had wanted a divorce, I would have given it to her. We could have both walked away from this wrecked marriage. Instead, now my revenge would be swift and total. There would be no mercy for either of them. The plan started coming together in my mind. I left the office and found a payphone down the street. Dialing an untraceable burner phone, I told Victor that it was time for me to collect on the debt he owed me. When I got home around 7:30, I found Laura already there, watching TV. She didn't bother getting up to greet me, only commenting on my late arrival. I casually noted that she'd been coming home late too, as I made my way to the kitchen. The silence between us was thick. I grabbed a beer and went to my office, making sure to lock the door behind me. In this country, someone convicted of a capital crime usually gets one of two sentences: the death penalty or life in prison. My revenge plan would involve both, one death penalty and one life sentence. I needed some quiet time to finalize everything. Victor would handle Mark Hudson, and I'd personally take care of Laura. To make the revenge appear as if Laura had simply walked away from our marriage, I laid the groundwork. I sent flowers to her office and made dinner reservations at a restaurant near her workplace. I left messages asking her to meet me, but she never showed up. I made sure the maitre d' knew my wife had stood me up, telling him to give our table away to someone else so he'd remember me. That night, Laura came home without a word of explanation for missing dinner. Not that I cared what she had to say. The die was cast, and the gears of revenge were already in motion. The next day, a courier showed up at my office with an envelope marked personal and confidential. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The bold heading instructed me to destroy it after reading. The first sentence advised me to make sure I had an airtight alibi for that evening. The second sentence gave me a name, Carlos Mandara, and a phone number. I memorized the number, then shredded the paper into tiny pieces. I gathered the shreds and discreetly disposed of them in various trash cans outside the office building. That evening, I got home earlier than usual. I changed clothes, poured a tall glass of whiskey, and put on some jazz. The TV stayed off. This was my night, and I was going to enjoy being the king of my own castle. Laura could find her own entertainment. When she finally got home, she took one look at the scene, turned around, and walked right back out. I didn't care where she was headed. Whether to meet Mark Hudson or just get something to eat, it didn't matter. Time was running out for both of them. By the time she slipped into bed beside me later that night, I was already on the verge of sleep. The silence between us was deafening. Thursday nights were poker nights with some guys from work, held in the back room of the old Stagecoach bar. It was the perfect alibi. That night, I stayed out late, playing cards and drinking with the guys. When I finally crawled into bed in the early hours of the morning, the clock read 2:35. Laura was sound asleep. Despite everything that had happened, falling asleep wasn't difficult, even though I knew what had taken place earlier that night. Mark Hudson had already faced his death sentence. Now, it was time for Laura to serve her life sentence. Immediate action wasn't necessary. Her punishment would come after a single phone call. As I lay there, I felt no more compassion for the woman I had once loved with all my heart. The impending retribution was of her own making. Whatever had driven her to betray me was for someone else to figure out. I just knew it was over. Justice, in its own twisted way, was coming for her. The police interviewed everyone at Ridgeway Realty, gathering bits and pieces of information, most of it contradictory. Laura faced several interviews with Detective Harper, who eventually questioned me about Mark Hudson. He subtly implied there might have been more than just a professional relationship between Mark and Laura. I calmly denied any suspicions and expressed complete trust in my wife's fidelity. The detective gave me a small, pitying smile, as if I were just another clueless husband. Mark Hudson's funeral was held the following Tuesday. That morning, I watched Laura put on the same black dress she had worn to my mother's funeral. She didn't ask if I wanted to accompany her to the service, and I didn't offer. Whatever thoughts she had about Mark's death, she kept to herself. She had a lot to think about. Her infidelity, the murder, but none of it concerned me anymore. Over the next week, Laura seemed eager to talk about our relationship, to have a serious discussion. But I gave her the cold shoulder at every turn. Her attempts at reconciliation didn't matter anymore. There was nothing left to save. I knew I'd moved beyond any hope of reconciliation. I had the power to end this charade whenever I chose. 3 weeks after Mark's murder, the police investigation seemed to stall. No new leads came up, and there were even hints that Mark might have been killed by a loan shark or a bookie. During this time, Laura's mental state continued to spiral. She became more absent-minded, and seemed confused all the time. Small things scared her, but I offered no comfort. Watching her unravel, I simply thought to myself, too bad. Finally, on the following Thursday, I made the call to Carlos. The plan was already in place, and he was eager to get it going. Laura only had a few hours left before her new life would begin. Friday morning, I left the house before Laura had even gotten dressed, deliberately avoiding one last encounter. The sand in the hourglass had run out. Across the street from our house, a car sat waiting. When Laura stopped at a four-way intersection, the abduction happened swiftly. Cars were positioned in front and behind her, making any escape impossible. With the precision of a trained team, two men moved quickly. The driver's side door flew open, and a needle was jabbed into her arm while the seatbelt was sliced away. Laura was pushed into the passenger seat, and one of the men slid behind the wheel. All three cars sped off, the entire operation taking less than 30 seconds. Not a single witness. At 11 a.m. that morning, at a branch bank on the east side of town, a woman who looked exactly like Laura walked in. She handed a withdrawal slip for $25,000 from our joint account to the teller, along with a driver's license and passport. After a few minutes, the teller issued the withdrawal as a cashier's check, and a security guard escorted the woman to her car, noting the license plate as she drove away. The next stop was the American Airlines ticket counter. The Laura lookalike stepped up, presented her ID and passport, and collected her boarding pass. Flight reservations had been made online the night before. The first leg of the trip was to JFK Airport, followed by a non-stop flight to Rio de Janeiro. The departure from Cleveland was at 4:45 p.m., reaching New York at 10:30 that night. The American Airlines flight took off, carrying one Laura Gallo on an overnight flight to Brazil. I waited until noon on Saturday before contacting the police to report her as a missing person. To my surprise, Detective Harper was the one who came to take my statement. I told him that Laura had come home at her usual time but then disappeared. Attempts to reach her on her cell phone went nowhere. The number was no longer in service. When I contacted Amanda, one of Laura's close friends at Ridgeway Realty, she told me that Laura hadn't shown up for work on Friday and hadn't called in, either. Detective Harper made a few cryptic notes in his notepad, occasionally glancing up at me. He then started asking questions about our marriage, probing for any potential problems that might have contributed to Laura's disappearance. I repeated what I had told him earlier. Our marriage was fine, and I couldn't think of any reason for Laura to suddenly vanish. Then, the detective asked if I had anything to do with her disappearance. I emphatically expressed my love for my wife and my absolute inability to harm her. Lying to the police was a skill I had learned early on from my days with the junior mafia, and it was still serving me well. 3 days later, Detective Harper visited my office during business hours, clearly trying to get a better read on me. He sat down, offered me a tight-lipped smile, and I put on the look of a distressed husband as I asked if there was any news on Laura. He said they had been able to retrace some of her movements after she left the house that Friday morning. Some of it was positive, some of it not. He told me that several people had seen Laura having coffee at a diner on Bennett Street around 10 a.m. that Friday morning. He went on to say that Laura had shown up at the Allegheny National Bank around 11 a.m., something that was caught on the bank's surveillance cameras. She had made a $25,000 withdrawal from our joint savings account. As Harper shared this information, I expressed disbelief and questioned how that could be possible, insisting that Laura hadn't mentioned anything about taking out such a large sum of money. Detective Harper remained calm, saying that the facts were clear. The bank had even made photocopies of Laura's driver's license and passport before issuing the cashier's check. He assured me that when I saw the surveillance tape, I would recognize the woman at the teller window as my wife. Harper paused, watching me carefully, waiting for my reaction to this bombshell. I looked back at him, keeping my expression bewildered and hurt. I told him I believed there must be some kind of mistake, stressing that Laura and I always talked about everything and I couldn't understand why she'd do something like this. I kept my voice steady, maintaining eye contact with him the whole time. I knew he was saving the worst for last. Finally, Harper leaned forward and delivered the final piece of devastating news. Laura had purchased airline tickets, one to New York and the other to Rio de Janeiro. Detective Harper mentioned they had found Laura's car parked in the long-term lot at the airport. Her flight had left Cleveland on Friday afternoon at 4:45, with a connecting flight to Rio de Janeiro departing from New York at 10:30 that same night. The detective told me they had already contacted the authorities in Rio to try and track her down, but it seemed that once she arrived in Brazil, she vanished. Harper stared at me, waiting for my reaction. I slammed my hands on the desk and exclaimed, "This is insane. Laura would never do something like that." I went on, talking about my belief in her love for me and how absurd it was to think she would leave the country. Then, trying to play the part of the heartbroken husband, I forced myself to cry right in front of the detective. There was an uncomfortable silence in my office as he watched me, before he cleared his throat and resumed talking. He asked if I thought this disappearance could be linked to Mark Hudson's homicide. I responded sharply, asking how he could even suggest such a thing. I reminded him that Laura had already been interviewed in connection with Mark's murder and was never charged. The detective clarified that while she wasn't charged, she had remained high on their suspect list. I raised my eyebrows and leaned forward, expressing disbelief. People might have gossiped about Laura and Mark, but that's hardly proof of anything, I said, challenging his implication. Harper explained that the investigation was still ongoing, but now that Laura had fled the country, their suspicions about her role in the homicide had intensified. He paused before revealing a disturbing detail. Evidence at the crime scene indicated that Mark had been tortured for hours before being strangled. I let out a small, mocking laugh. "You think Laura did that? She can barely open a jar of pickles, let alone torture and strangle someone," I said, dismissing the idea. I could feel my frustration rising as the accusations grew more ridiculous. The detective, unfazed, acknowledged that while the evidence suggested Laura's involvement, they suspected she might have had help. I raised an eyebrow, surprised, and asked if he thought I might be that other person. Before I could press him further, Harper quickly added that, based on their timeline, I had a solid alibi for the night of Mark's murder. Still, his voice lacked the usual certainty, making it clear he had his doubts. I stood up, glaring at him. "So let me get this straight. You think my wife fled the country because she's guilty of murder, and somehow I'm involved in helping her?" I asked, my voice filled with indignation. Harper sat quietly for a moment, studying me. I could see him trying to determine whether my outrage was genuine. I gave him a final look of disdain and said, "If that's all, this meeting is over." I walked over to the door, opened it, and signaled that it was time for him to leave. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Camillo. I'll keep you informed about your wife's disappearance," Harper said as he stood up, moving slowly toward the door. He didn't offer his hand, and I didn't extend mine. After he left, I shut the door and sank back into my swivel chair. I knew Harper's visit wasn't about giving me any real information. He was fishing, trying to see if I would slip up. But my alibis were airtight. I'd been playing poker the night Mark Hudson was killed, and I'd been in meetings all day the Friday Laura disappeared. I was in the clear, and he knew it. 2 weeks after Laura's disappearance, there was still no word from Carlos or Victor. Laura's whereabouts remained unknown, and I hadn't heard from her or about her well-being. Occasionally, I had the feeling that someone was tailing me during my morning commute or evening drives home, but nothing came of it. My actions remained predictable, from work to home, with occasional grocery stops. There was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing suspicious. Every couple of days, I called Detective Harper for updates on Laura, playing the role of the concerned husband. Each time, he had nothing new to report. The Brazilian police hadn't found any evidence of Laura after her arrival in Rio, and she seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Later that afternoon, I reflected on how perfectly everything had played out so far. But even though the plan was going smoothly, I knew the next phase of my revenge was still to come. I ordered a pizza from Domino's while watching college football on TV. The doorbell rang, and the delivery guy handed me my hot pizza. I paid him and gave a couple of bucks as a tip. When I opened the pizza box in the kitchen, I noticed an envelope sitting on top. Opening it, I found a sheet of paper with instructions for the next day. It directed me to dress for church and attend the 10 a.m. Mass at St. Peter's. The note also told me to slip out of the side door on the east side of the church during communion, where a dark Ford Crown Victoria would be waiting. Holding the paper, I understood this was going to be my final meeting with Laura before Carlos shipped her out of the country. He had waited 2 weeks to let the well-documented cover story of Laura flying out of the country be the main evidence the police had to follow. Carlos had set up an elaborate deception to throw the investigation off, making it look like Laura was still alive when she boarded that plane to Rio. It kept the police from building a circumstantial case against me, even though there was no body. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the pitch-black room. This past month and a half had been a living nightmare, ever since I received that damning email. Everything that had happened since then reminded me that no matter how much I tried to leave it behind, my roots, my dark side, would always resurface when I felt disrespected. Nature or nurture, it didn't matter. I knew exactly where that darkness came from. St. Peter's is a big church, and the 10 a.m. Mass draws a crowd of hundreds. It was easy to blend in and spot if anyone was following me. If the police were trailing me, they stayed outside the church. As the throng of people moved to the front for communion, I slipped out the side door. The dark Ford sedan was waiting with the engine running. I climbed into the back seat, and the car pulled away, merging into the busy street. The trip took about 10 minutes before the sedan pulled up to a large warehouse. The driver didn't turn around, just told me to enter through the side door. Inside, the building was mostly empty, but there was an office area near the back with lights glowing from the windows. As I approached, Carlos stepped out and walked toward me. It was our first face-to-face meeting. Carlos greeted me, saying Carmine had told him it was okay to call me JC. We shook hands, and he gave me a stoic look before warning me that Laura wasn't the same anymore. He hinted that seeing her might be upsetting. I shrugged it off, telling him I didn't care about her condition or what she'd been through since they took her. We walked toward an open door, and I asked if she was on any medication. Carlos shook his head and said she wasn't, but added that she probably wished she were. He claimed to have kept her clean and fully conscious the whole time, stating she was now a broken woman and well-trained for her new life. When we entered the brightly lit room, I saw Laura tied to a chair in the center. I walked slowly around her, eventually stopping right in front of her. She didn't move or speak, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond me, her eyes devoid of the sparkle they once had. I spoke to her calmly, telling her that for the rest of her life, she would remember that she brought all this misery upon herself. I reminded her of all the times I had put up with her mood swings and her coldness, and how her affair, her blatant disrespect, was what led us here. I told her that Mark had already paid for his part in this and that she was next. Speaking slowly, I made sure she understood that it was me who brought her and her lover to justice. I made it clear that despite having once loved her, I now felt nothing but disgust. I let her know that Carlos assured me she'd be well taken care of wherever she was going, treated with the same care they give to their prized horses and cattle. I stood there for a moment longer, watching as a single tear formed in her eye. It was the only response I got before I turned and left the room. The Ford sedan drove me back to St. Peter's. I slipped back into the church just as the 11 o'clock Mass ended, blending in with the crowd as I left and drove straight home. A hard knot was sitting in my gut, and I drowned it with some Jim Beam. It's been 3 years since I last saw Laura. By now, I've almost forgotten about her completely. After her disappearance, I sold the house we shared and moved on. Detective Harper's cases have since gone cold. I spend more time with Victor at the Sweet Fox Lounge, enjoying the company of that young stripper more than once. Marriage is out of the question now. My 5 years with Laura convinced me that women are more trouble than they're worth once you marry them. My parents were right. I should have listened to them when they warned me about getting involved with Laura. I later found out that Amanda, one of Laura's co-workers, was the one who sent me that email. Turns out, she had been Mark Hudson's lover before he dumped her for Laura. I never thanked her for the email, nor did I ask how she got those photos of Mark and Laura. I guess she got her revenge at the same time I did. There's truth to that old saying about the wrath of a woman scorned.